All right, y'all, you're Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I'm talking about the Falcons' preseason finale victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars. And we're going to be talking about which players increased their chances of making the Falcons roster, as well as talk quite a bit about Desmond Ridder and how his up and down performance against the Jaguars is also a mirror for what type of rookie season he may wind up having.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, your very humble host of this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Brightco Jewelry and Watch Insurance. Brightco brings you comprehensive, fast, and affordable jewelry insurance for as low as $5 per month. Check out our special offer for Locked On listeners and get covered in under 2 minutes at bright.co/locked on. That's bright.co/locked on. So, guys, we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, as well on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us a like, and you will get the video version of the podcast tonight before the audio drops. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about this Jaguars game. If you want to sort of get more into the nitty gritty of the specifics of the game, Jarvis Davis, my co-host on the Locked On Falcons postcast, we recorded that. That's also currently on your Locked On Falcons audio feed, but you can check out the video version on the Locked On Sports Atlanta. Sort of today, we're going to be talking about the big takeaways from the game. You know, it was notable to me that the Falcons rested their starters. We'll talk about sort of which guys that did play and which guys that didn't play and how that sort of figures into the conversation around who's going to make the 53-man roster. But talking about the game itself, the big takeaway on offense was a strong performance from the Falcons rushing attack. They finished the game with 41 carries, 135 yards rushing, 3 rushing touchdowns, 1 each for Quadri Ollison, Tyler Algier, and Caleb Huntley. On the defensive side of the ball, it was a strong day for the Falcons interior defensive line that really sort of dominated the line of scrimmage. You saw Abdullah Anderson probably stood out arguably the most of that game, but you also saw, disruption from Nick Thurman. Derek Tangelo was stout. You also saw some positive plays from Timmy Horn, Darian Daniels, as well as other players on that defensive front. So this was clearly a game where the Falcons' second and third string players in the trenches were able to dominate by and large, the Jaguars' second and third string players. But we'll talk about those defensive linemen as well as other standouts a little bit later in today's episode. Let's start the conversation talking about the Falcons' young quarterback. That's the guy who everybody wants to talk about. We're talking, of course, about Desmond Ridder. No, Felipe Franks. But no, Desmond Ridder got the start. I was happy to see him play through the first 3 quarters into the fourth quarter. I feel like he needed a start here to sort of get a feel for how to start an NFL football game, go into halftime, come out. Obviously it's preseason, so they're not making massive halftime adjustments, but to get a little bit of that experience under his belt, because this may be the last action we see Desmond Ridder get for several weeks and or months. And in the meantime, he's not going to get a ton of practice reps either in season with Mariota taking all those first team snaps during the week. So I think that was a real positive sign. Overall, it was kind of an up and down performance for Desmond Ridder. He threw an interception on the opening play of the game, but then sort of battled back on the next drive, went 5 for 5 passing on that next drive for 40 yards, capped off with a 2-yard touchdown throw to Tyler Algier to get the Falcons their first touchdown. That drive also included 3 successful third down conversions on Desmond Ridder throws. He did wind up throwing another interception to close out the first half, where the Falcons, with like 7 seconds left in the half, dialed up a shot play, and with pressure in his face, he sort of underthrew Frank Darby on a deep ball. And that initial pick was also had pressure in his face. But he then again battled back in the second half and made a number of key plays, was able to hit Darby on a perfect strike down the sideline, a 35-yard bomb, showed great placement on that, had another explosive play on a quick slant to Keyshawn Johnson, where he was able to create after the catch, did a nice job later on that same drive that included a Keyshawn Johnson throw for 34 yards, where he was able to avoid pressure off the edge, step up in the pocket, deliver a sidearm throw to Anthony Ferkser, crossing over the middle for a 21-yard gain to put the ball down at the 1-yard line. Caleb Huntley punched it in on the ensuing play, and that gave the Falcons a 21-12 lead. And then he made a nice throw to close out the third quarter, hitting Cameron Batson on a deep crosser on another 21-yard gain, where he also had pressure in his face. And so I know a lot of people are already in the comments arguing about, Mariota versus Ridder. And I know these debates are going to continue to rage for weeks and or months, if not years. But I do think when we have this conversation about Desmond Ridder and specifically, and not how it relates to Marcus Mariota, which is a separate conversation, in my opinion, I think when we're having a conversation about Desmond Ridder, we have to remember that he is young. He's certainly not there yet, but I think so far, when you give it in the context of where his development is for a rookie quarterback, he is far more advanced than I think even his biggest proponents, or maybe not his biggest proponents, but the majority of people that like Desmond Ridder. He is showing exactly what you wanted to see if you were a big proponent of Desmond Ridder coming out of this draft class. And I think the thing that people need to remember, it's been a very long time since we've had a young quarterback with expectations here in Atlanta. It's been 14 years since we had a rookie quarterback with those sort of expectations. And I know the perception is that Matt Ryan from the jump was great. And he was very good. He had one of the best rookie seasons in NFL history back in 2008. But that shouldn't necessarily mean that Matt Ryan was by any means flawless as a rookie. He had his fair share of ups and downs and inconsistency. And this was a point I tried to stress throughout May and June earlier on this podcast, where that when you have these young quarterbacks, mistakes and inconsistency are going to be par for the course, no matter how good they are. And part of the reason that I talked about those things and stressed how important the running game was and how having a good defense was, because, to sort of balance things out, when you have, whether it was a young Matt Ryan or now in the future with Desmond Ridder, you want to take the burden off of that young quarterback by being able to stabilize your offense with a healthy running game, and then basically taking pressure off of him by having a competent defense that's not going to force that guy to have to throw the ball 40 times in a game in order to win. And so when you look at the second drive of this game, where after Ridder had thrown that initial interception, the Falcons went on a 15-play, 75-yard drive. They called 8 called runs on that play, 7 called passes. One of those called passes, resulted in a Ridder scramble. But on those first 3 runs on that drive, at least the called ones, the Falcons weren't able to do much. They combined for a combined 2 yards on those 3 plays. But then on the subsequent 5 runs, they combined for about 31 yards, and 16 of those runs came in the red zone, sort of taking pressure off the team and the quarterback to have to deliver in the red zone and being able to rely on their running game. And so to me, that signaled what you want to see from this offense if and when Desmond Ridder is tasked with being the starting quarterback, whether that's this year, whether that's next year. Again, that conversation, I will leave it to you guys to argue until you're blue in the face in the comments and elsewhere about that. But you want to have this balanced offensive attack, and we saw that on the second drive. And I think Ridder did a good job, particularly as the game wore on, managing things in the second half, certainly better than he did in the first half. And that's kind of the story on Desmond Ridder as a prospect, where you would watch these games, and early in the game, you'd be a little erratic, he'd be a little inconsistent. But then once he sort of settled in, got in a rhythm, you would start to see that player that a lot of people had as their QB1 from this past draft class. And this, game kind of showed all of that. sort of stuff. And so I think that was certainly on display against the Jaguars. But I do think this game also showed you the value of what having a balanced offense can be, not only for Desmond Ridder, but also for Marcus Mariota as well. This is the type of offense that I think Arthur Smith wants to have in Atlanta, being a team that can run the ball, maybe not 40 times every single week, but certainly 30 or more times every single week, and can take pressure off of the various other aspects of the team, including that offensive line. So they're not getting into situations that they can't handle by having to pass protect every single snap. And whether the Falcons can accomplish that has less to do with Desmond Ridder or Marcus Mariota being the quarterback, and more to do with that offensive line being able to take care of business, not only being able to create holes to facilitate a balanced rushing attack, but also to protect that quarterback moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up, and talk as well about which players sort of stood out in this game, who helped or hurt their roster chances as well. But before we get there, guys, the internet is the place for epic fails, whether you're at a gender reveal gone wrong or you're making a very public proposal that does not go quite your way. And that may be due to the certain someone saying no to you in front of 20,000 people, or you were trying to be romantic and go out on a date on a boat, or go to the pier where you first took her on a date, and you got down on your knee on one knee, and that ring that you spent several months saving up for winds up in the water somehow. You don't want to be that guy. So you certainly don't want to see your failure splattered all over the internet and going viral for all the wrong reasons. But while there isn't really any insurance to prevent that special someone from saying no, there is protection to keep that ring from winding up in the wrong places. And the people at Bright Code Jewelry Insurance will make sure that you get the replacement for the full value of your ring, no matter if it's lost, stolen, or you just can't figure out what happened to it. Just go to bright.co/locked on. It's the fastest, easiest, and cheapest way to cover your butt with the best jewelry insurance in the business. And guys, I want to tell you about Turo, the world's largest car sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from any community of local hosts. Browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the US, Canada, and the UK. You can book a spacious SUV or minivan for that family road trip you're taking. You can get a classic or luxury car for a special event, holiday, or birthday. You can find an affordable economy cars if you're on a budget and just need to get from A to B. You can test drive that new electric vehicle that you've had your eye on for a while and see how it fits into your everyday life. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Ditch boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. That's Turo.com. So, guys, I want to thank you again for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And as your second listen, make the ultimate pro football preview starting this Wednesday on August 31st. It's an 8-episode extravaganza. Make that your second listen of the day. You'll be hearing from local team experts like myself, as well as Odyssey NFL insiders, combining for that ultimate NFL preview. All you got to do beginning Wednesday, August 31st, is to search for the Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. So before we move on, I do briefly want to reiterate this point. We did see the running game work in this game against the Jaguars, pretty much regardless of who was the running back. I know people are going to, fight over, this running back versus that running back, Mike Davis versus Tyler Algier, Quadri Olson versus Caleb Huntley, Damian Williams versus whoever. But, it didn't matter who the running back was, because the offensive line was able to create holes and lanes for all of them. And this is part of, the conversation of why running backs have been so devalued in recent years, is because the perception is like, if you block it, they will run, right, so to speak. And I think when we get to a point where we can facilitate this Arthur Smith led balanced rushing attack, it's going to be mostly due to who's lining up on the offensive line versus who's lining up in the backfield. And I think, we can double down on this point about the offensive line, reiterating, how important it's going to be for not only the running game, but also the passing game due to the pass protection. And that was also on display on Saturday with Desmond Ridder. When you look at Desmond Ridder's bad throws on Saturday against the Jaguars, as well as those, turnover worthy plays earlier this summer in the preseason against the Lions, every single one of them resulted from interior pressure in his face. And this was one of the reasons why post-draft, after we drafted Desmond Ridder, I kind of downplayed the whole notion of him being this mobile quarterback. Although, to his credit, his mobility and running ability has been much better than I expected it to be in this preseason. But essentially, the argument I was making then was that he's kind of more of this pocket quarterback that can run fast, right? And longtime listeners know, going back to the beginning of 2021, this was important because one of the things I talked about then was, how do you build your offensive line to suit your quarterback? And when we had a pocket passer like Matt Ryan, and now continuing potentially, arguably, with Desmond Ridder, you want to have a strong interior offensive line to be the sort of that anchor point for that guy to step up in. We saw that displayed on that play to Ferkser as well. But with more mobile quarterbacks, and you could probably put Marcus Mariota into this camp as well, you want to build it more outside in from your offensive line and have those anchor points be the tackles, because those guys like to extend outside the pocket, rolling to the left, rolling to the right, those types of things. And so I think, it reiterates the point you've heard me say 1,000 times before on this podcast, but this offensive line isn't quite where we want it to be quite yet. But one day soon, hopefully, it will be. And I think that's going to require investments on this interior, continued investments on this interior line, and that will increase the odds that a player like Desmond Ridder, should he be the Falcons franchise quarterback in the near future. And again, I just don't want any beef. I don't want no smoke in the comments, guys. That's why I'm being indecisive when it comes to Desmond Ridder's future. You know actually where my head is at, but I just don't want the smoke in the comments. But when we, if and when we turn the keys to Desmond Ridder, it's going to be important to solidify that interior offensive line, and we'll see if this year's group starts that process. We still don't know who's going to be the starting center week one, because Hennessy and Dahlman didn't play, and my expectation was whoever started this game would be the starter come week one. But since neither one of those guys played, but speaking of who did and did not play in this game, to me it was notable, that the Falcons sat, obviously pretty much all their starters, and a couple of key backups. Now, there were some players that we knew going into this game would make the roster, did wind up playing, Desmond Ridder being one of those, Tyler Algier being another, Anthony Ferkser as well, sort of on the offense. Defensively, D'Angelo Malone, Arnold Ebiketie, Troy Anderson, Darren Hall, D. Alford, Mike Ford also played in this game. Obviously Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and the Highlander Liam McCullough also played as well. But to me, what was notable, a couple of guys that also played that we feel like are probably going to make the team, but I wouldn't sit here and guarantee them a roster spot, like Damiere Byrd and Felipe Franks and Nick Kwiatkowski. Also worth noting that Dion Jones did get his first action of the summer. I was surprised to see him play off of 2 weeks of practice, but we'll talk a little bit more about Dion Jones later in today's episode. But it was notable which guys didn't play in this game, right? Jalen Mayfield didn't play, although that could have been injury related. He was dealing with some sickness earlier this week. Kobe Gossett did not play, at least not on offense. He did get some snaps on special teams on the field goal team, along with Drew Dahlman as well. Parker Hesse did not play in this game, and he seems locked into that sort of Lee Smith role as a blocking tight end. Avery Williams also did not play in this game. He seems locked into that return role. That's something I've discussed, but I know other people out there felt like he was potentially on the bubble and fighting for a roster spot. Kadero Hodge, again, another guy that, I thought was very much a safe bet to make the roster this year. Sort of reiterates the point that maybe he's a lock as well. Damian Williams, another guy, again, I thought was likely to land the third down running back role, but I know a lot of people were talking about him potentially be on the bubble as well. So I look at those 6 players: Mayfield, Gossett, Hesse, Avery Williams, Damian Williams, and Kadero Hodge, I'm sorry. And you sit there and you go, like, are all these guys, guaranteed a spot on 53-man roster? And I kind of lean, yeah. I think probably Mayfield and Gossett are the 2 out of that 6-man group that are probably on the least sure footing. But you kind of would think that if those guys were fighting for roster spots, you would want to get another chance to evaluate them in a game. So we'll see how that plays out. But we'll also talk about some other people that stood out that helped their roster chances, moving on from the guys that are already sort of locked in at this point in time, including Quentin Bell. who had a big time punt block in this game that also set up a score against the Jaguars. We'll get into that as we continue today's episode, as well as talk about Deion Jones. But before we get there, guys, I do want to talk a little bit about the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, where you get 3 shows: A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste, breaking down local sports, national sports. Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube is also the place for the Locked On Braves postcast, the Locked On Falcons postcast, where Jarvis and I will be breaking down every Falcons win and loss and tie, each and every Sunday this year as the season unfolds. If you have missed those on YouTube, you can also check those out on the Locked On Falcons audio podcast feed. But make sure you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So, guys, I also want to tell you about Prize Picks, a new fun way to play daily fantasy. You can pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their prize pick projections, you win. For example, if you believe Kyle Pitts will have more or less than 55.5 receiving yards against the Saints in week 1, you pick that. Will Josh Allen have more or less than 275.5 passing yards versus the Rams in week 1? And the great thing about Prize Picks is you're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections. They offer projections on any sport you want: NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB, college sports, golf, pretty much all of them. And Prize Picks is a safe, fast, and easy. It's currently operational in 30 states in the US and Canada. All you got to do is download the Prize Picks apps or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with a promo code Locked On. That means if you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On, LOCKEDON, at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. So, as I said earlier, when we're talking about the players that stepped up, the interior D-line stepped up big in this game. I went into the game expecting kind of Nick Thurman and Abdullah Anderson to sort of be the top options to stick on this roster alongside, Grady Jarrett and Taquan Graham and Anthony Rush and potentially Marlon Davidson. And I kind of came out of the game still believing they were the 2 likeliest guys to be in the mix for a roster spot. But I certainly think Timmy Horn, Darian Daniels, Derek Tangelo all made their fair share of plays and will certainly make that decision harder for the Falcons decision makers when it comes down to cut down day on Tuesday. And we'll see also if the Falcons still, feel compelled after Saturday's performance that their D-line depth is as big a concern as it seemed to be that we've been discussing basically for 2 months now. And so, or really 3-4 months now. And so, I think the performance of those guys may suggest that they feel pretty good about that group of players. And you also kind of wonder, did the performances of some of these young guys make a guy like Marlon Davidson even more expendable? Davidson was kind of already on the bubble due to his lack of availability, due to the constant injuries. And you wonder if, some of the performance of some of these other young guys may be just enough to kind of push him fully out the door if he was kind of on the fence, to mix my metaphors. Or do, the Falcons potentially, maybe they, I don't know the extent of his injury, but maybe they could wait till Wednesday, put him on the IR and that make it a short-term thing. So he may miss the first month of the season. And that clears a roster spot for one of these young guys to be kept at least through the month of September. So we'll see how that plays out. Notably, player coming back from injury was Nick Kwiatkowski alongside Dion Jones. They got their first preseason action in the first quarter of this game. Notably, Dion Jones did play some kickoff coverage. He hasn't played special teams coverage basically since his rookie season. Steve Weish of NFL Network reiterated during the broadcast that something that Jeff Schultz said earlier at the beginning of the month, that, the Falcons have no intention of cutting Dion Jones. Big blow to the brand with that. So I still have questions on whether or not the Falcons are going to give that roster spot to Dion Jones over potentially a player like Quentin Bell. right? And I know, a lot of you are like, why do you hate Debo so much? And I'm like, I don't hate Debo. And then I'm sure others of you are like, you just want the Falcons to cut Dion Jones just so that you can be right. And I'm like, no, you might be getting a little warmer on that one. But you know, it's not that I don't think Dion Jones can contribute to the team. He absolutely can be a worthwhile contributor to this football team. Um, you know, but at the same time, like you also know he doesn't really have a future here. That if a trade does come along for the Falcons at some point in the next few days, or in the next 2 months before the trade deadline, you know that they're going to move on from him. You also know that after the season, the Falcons are almost certainly 99.99% chance that they're going to cut him next offseason. And so you're looking at what role does Dion Jones have this season, right? He can come off the bench, right? In a similar situation that Michael Walker did last year, but Michael Walker was only getting like 5 snaps a game last year coming off the bench in those nickel passing situations. And wouldn't it be better for your team, in the long run, to give those snaps, if you're going to give those snaps to anybody, not Dion Jones, but to Troy Anderson? Isn't that going to help his development in the future, given that you invested a second round pick in him and you have a vested interest in him developing over whatever you get out of Dion Jones at this point in time? And then if you're going to put Dion Jones on coverage teams and play special teams like the Falcons did on Saturday against the Jaguars, wouldn't those special team snaps be better served for a potentially better special teams player, and certainly a guy that has a future as a special teams maven potentially, based off of what he did against the Jaguars, in Quentin Bell? Right. And Quentin Bell was a player that 2 weeks ago, after that first preseason game against the Lions, we talked about him on this podcast as a guy that his special teams contributions are a signal that he is potentially poised to make the roster, to the point that on Friday, I was like, I think Quentin Bell will make the roster. But now I sit here, questioning that, because, I feel like that decision may come down to keeping Quentin Bell on the roster or keeping Dion Jones on the roster, or that decision may come down to keeping, Dion Jones. Maybe you keep both Quentin Bell and Dion Jones, but then Dion Jones is taking a spot for, say, Jared Bernhardt or somebody like that. And so, like, I just sit here and I go, like, this is part of the reason why, like, I feel like if you've moved on from Dion Jones emotionally and mentally, just make the move at this point in time to pull the Band-Aid off, and just move on. But we'll just sort of have to see it. Now, granted, I know to a lot of folks, part of that, my reasoning is like, go with the young guy, right? A Quentin Bell, a Jared Bernhardt, somebody like that, because I don't have high expectations for this 2022 season. For me, this is kind of an evaluation year. So you want to get these young guys on opportunities to play on Sundays to evaluate them. But, I know other people feel differently, because they feel like this team, could do some things, do some damage this year. And having a player like Dion Jones could, sort of be the cherry on top, so to speak, I guess you could say. But, I just sit here and wonder, if you're going to wind up keeping Dion Jones, you're going to force a young player off your roster. Maybe that player winds up getting claimed off of waivers on Tuesday. Maybe that player, does make it through waivers, and, you put him on your practice squad, but then later down the season, some team comes along and poaches him off the practice squad. So, I know the perception is that there's no downside to keeping Dion Jones, but, like, for me, I don't see really much of an upside, outside of hoping, praying, that a good trade comes along at some point in the next 2 months. Again, no one thought going into the trade deadline that Mohamed Sanu would have netted a second round pick. But then again, the Falcons weren't shopping Mohamed Sanu for 18 months prior to that, which we probably would have had a better idea about that. But so we'll sort of see how that goes. But for me, I just we'll see if the Falcons do decide to keep Dion Jones, or to cut him, or a trade does happen in the next couple of days. But I just move on. But that's my opinion. That's my official opinion. So let's move on from Dion Jones and talk about some of the guys that really move the needle up and change the status for my roster projection. Again, if I was looking at from what I talked about on Friday's episode, and the changes I would make now that we've seen, what the Falcons and who shined in this preseason finale, honestly, I wouldn't make too many changes. I felt like going into Friday's episode, going in Saturday, I had a pretty good grasp on who was going to make this team. Not too many changes I would make, but one of them would be potentially dropping Quentin Bell from my 53-man roster projection and putting him on the practice squad and keeping Dion Jones on the 53-man roster. Now, the day I recorded that episode was before the Falcons had officially cut Rick Leonard. So obviously he was a guy that I had on my 53-man roster projection. So he's no longer an option there. And I would probably replace him with Kobe Gossett at this point in time. Outside of that, there wouldn't be any major changes to my 53-man projection based off of what I said on Friday. So go check out that episode on the card above. But, for the most part, I would say practice squad might get shuffled a little bit based off of Saturday's performance. I think Quadri Olison, I think, was my pick for the running back on the practice squad, but I think Caleb Huntley made a very compelling case on Saturday against the Jaguars. Stanley Berryhill I had on making the practice squad alongside Frank Darby and Jared Bernhardt. I think Keyshawn Johnson might have done enough just to maybe question Berryhill's spot. I think at the very least, maybe the Falcons, he's done just enough in the last 10 days he's been on the team to maybe deserve a longer look. And so therefore you might keep him on the practice squad for the first, few weeks of the season, just to give him that longer look in practice and whatnot. I had Justin Schaefer, Ryan Newsel, and Mike and Tyler Vrabel making the practice squad along the offensive line. I've liked what I've seen from Leroy Watson. I think he has a lot of potential to development. And if we're keeping Kobe Gossett instead of Rick Leonard, then that means maybe instead of adding another interior offensive lineman on the practice squad like Ryan Newsel, you go for a tackle like Leroy Watson. So that makes sense there. Dorian Etheridge I had making the practice squad, but his status is up in the air. He did get injured in his game. He was carted off against the Jaguars. Hopefully it's nothing serious, but we'll have to sort of wait and see. If he does go on injured reserve, that may be the opening to create the vacancy for Quentin Bell to come off the roster to the practice squad. And I also had Matt Hankins sticking on the practice squad, but it seems like this team really likes Corey Ballentine, given how much he's played over a guy like Hankins, even though I think, Ballentine has not looked particularly good in the preseason games, although he did have an interception off of deflection in this game. So we will continue to discuss these roster battles on tomorrow's episode. We'll have a guest in Kevin Knight of the Falcoholic to come on and share his insights into who he thinks is going to make the team. He's been breaking that down over at the Falcoholic all summer long. So if you've been checking out Kevin's stuff, you'll be happy to hear from him on tomorrow's episode. We'll also probably answer a couple of your roster related questions. I know one listener sent in a couple of questions about, how the practice squad works. So we'll probably have a chance to answer that on tomorrow's episode. But if you want to get your roster related questions answered on tomorrow's episode or future episodes, of course, I welcome all your feedback. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And then Tuesday, presumably, unless the Falcons decide to make their cuts a little bit early, we'll see what those official cuts are, and we'll have Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast, and of course the Locked On Falcons postcast to come on the podcast on Tuesday evening on YouTube and Wednesday on the audio version of the podcast to talk about all of that. And so the plan is, guys, that, after that we'll have 10 days or so between then and the start of the regular season. And we'll have a bunch of guests on to talk more about their thoughts on the team, as well as their expectations heading into this 2022 season. So look forward to that. So make sure you stay tuned here on Locked On Falcons as your first listen. And as your second listen, make sure you check out Locked On Fantasy Football, where host Vinny Iyer has over 20 years of NFL expertise to help you win your fantasy drafts and leagues this season. So subscribe to Locked On Fantasy Football on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Guys, I really appreciate it. I hope you had a great weekend. It's nice to see the Falcons playing well in the preseason, so we're not bored out of our minds watching, awful second halves of games. And so, I don't know if this is going to carry over in the regular season, but hey, one can hope, right? That this positive vibes and positive feelings from this team in the preseason will carry over into the regular season. Usually that's not how it works, but we'll see. We'll see if the Falcons can make an exception this year. The lower you are in the preseason, the better your regular season. The higher you are in your preseason, the lower your regular season. That tends to be often the case, particularly with the Falcons. But we'll see if they can sing a different tune this year. So guys, I really appreciate it. Till then.